History of African Americans. African Americans account for a large portion of the American population. At the turn of the 21st century, there were 36 million African Americans in the South, 2 million in New York City, 1 million in Chicago, and around 500,000 to 1 million African Americans living in Detroit, Philadelphia, and Houston. Early history of African Americans. History of African Americans began when 20 Africans were dropped in the English colony of Virginia in 1619. They worked as indentured servants who were bound to an employer for a limited number of years. Their population kept growing and reached 760,000 in 1790. Most of them were directly imported from Africa or were the children of slave mothers, accounting for 1/5 of the population of the United States. The blacks were documented into slavery in Virginia in 1661 and all the English colonies by 1750. During that time, they were considered an inferior race with heathen culture. They were forced to work in the farmlands of the New World. Africans were sold as merchandise by European traders on slave ships across the Atlantic Ocean to the West Indies, the region of the North Atlantic Ocean, and the Caribbean. At least 1/6 of them died during the journey due to shock, disease, and suicide. Slavery in America. During the period of the 17th and 18th centuries, Africans and African Americans, referring to those born in the New World, were forced to work as slaves on tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations of the southern coast, from the Chesapeake Bay colonies of Maryland and Virginia south to Georgia. Eventually, slavery became rooted in the South's huge cotton and sugar plantations. Legislation was passed by President Thomas Jefferson in 1807 to end the slave trade in America. However, it did nothing but boosted the domestic slave trade in the country. Black women were forced to conceive as early as age 13 and to give birth as often as possible. There were still free black people making up 1/10 of the entire African American population. They originated with former indentured servants and their descendants. Some of them migrated from the West Indies or were freed by their owners. But while in the South they were subject to restrictions imposed on slaves, in the North they were not allowed to vote, own any property, and travel freely. They even faced the risks of being kidnapped and enslaved. Movements to end slavery. Abolitionists in Britain and the United States in the 1840 to 1860 period developed large, complex propaganda campaigns against slavery. Among the free blacks in the North were emerging African American leaders in many states, such as Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. They initially held national and state conventions in early 1830. However, these people shared different opinions on how to deal with slavery and discrimination. Several leaders encouraged slaves to revolt and overthrow their masters, while others thought they should enhance the economy and establish a modern black country in Africa. Thus, African Americans founded Liberia in West Africa, which foreshadowed the development of Pan-African nationalism. American Civil War. According to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, there must be an equal number of slave and free states, but this was abrogated, leading to slavery in all American territory. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of America on the anti-slavery platform of the new Republican Party. At the beginning of 1861, a movement was launched in an attempt to liberate all the country's slaves. It was the Civil War. However, the initial goal of Lincoln was not to abort slavery, but to emancipate gradually, with the federal government compensating the slaveholders for the loss of their property. But in September of 1862, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, stating that all slaves were to be free, making the Civil War a war to end slavery. African Americans after the Civil War. After the Civil War, nearly 4 million slaves were freed, gained their citizenship, and the right to vote by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments respectively. However, all of these new provisions were ignored, especially in the South. During Reconstruction, with leadership from educated African Americans from the North and abroad, they gradually wielded political power in the South. However, it didn't last long due to economic pressure and violent anti-black activities, such as ones from the Ku Klux Klan. The white supremacy once again dominated, leading to racial separation all over the southern states. In the post-Reconstruction years, both African Americans in the South and the North struggled to find a job. So many of them decided to migrate westward. Impacts of World War I. In 1900, nearly 8 million African Americans still lived in the South. However, due to economic depression, more African Americans moved northwards and were then embroiled in World War I. During the war, thousands of black officers were commissioned, and many served abroad in labor battalions and service regiments. In 1919, the Universal Negro Improvement Association was established in the Harlem district of New York City by Marcus Garvey, a black nationalist born in Jamaica. With several 100,000 members, it is considered to be the largest mass movement of African Americans in the country's history. Garvey's movement ceased after he was of World War II. The outbreak of World War II, along with the industrial boom, put an end to the Depression in 1939. With support from President Roosevelt, African Americans secured more jobs at better wages during the war. More and more blacks migrated from the rural South to the industrial cities of the North, which was known as the Great Migration. However, due to culminating job competition along with serious housing shortages, race riots broke out in many areas. The worst occurred in Detroit in June 1943. During the war, a large portion of African American soldiers overseas were in service units and combat troops remained segregated. But then integrated officer training was subject to ratification. In 1949, 4 years after the end of World War II, the armed services finally adopted a policy of full integration.
1930s Georgia, the heart of the South. A young boy learns what the world's about. He can't play in parks, those are for whites only. He can't go to many restaurants to see the new movie. That's segregation, it's the law, and that means different schools and areas for whites and blacks. And he has a white friend who on one day says, sorry, but my dad won't let us play. Anger begins to boil under Martin's skin. He feels his dignity crushed by the world that he's living in. But he's not giving in, he's studying, debating, follows his dad's choice of an occupation. Becomes a minister, a leader in the church, and the young Reverend King, he gets to work in Montgomery, Alabama, where Rosa Parks is the spark that ignites the fight for civil rights. She refuses to move to the back of the bus, even though the law says that black people must. She's arrested. This is the act that King needs to stand up and fight for equality. He needs a bus boycott in Montgomery. Black folks refuse to ride and it hurts the economy. See, people might ignore your speeches and songs, but they tend to pay attention when their money is gone. The boycott lasts over a year, making news, and King becomes a leader in the civil rights movement. Civil rights are rights that every person should have, but those rights have been denied to blacks, and that's what Dr. King says.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream, that all men are created equal.
King was a leader, so he offered guidance and preached the practice of nonviolence with boycotts, marches, and sit-ins, peacefully protesting to get people to listen. The opposition wasn't peaceful in the least when the local police came with dogs on a leash and they opened up the fire hose on those in the streets. Americans watched the horror play out on TVs. King remembered what Jesus taught, that the remedy for hate is not hate, but love for your enemy. So he kept on, and in 1963, led the march in Washington, D.C. There he gave his most famous speech, where he told the world, I have a dream of a nation where his children wouldn't be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. This plea resonated in America, and new laws helped break down some barriers. Then in 1968, a white man with hatred in his heart and a gun in his hand shot and killed Dr. Martin Luther King. The nation mourned and wondered what the future would bring. The future is now. If King were there with you, would you tell him his dream came true? Because Dr. King says,
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Dr. King says,
I have a dream that one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with this faith. We will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, My Country Tears of Thee. Sweet land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrims cry. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. When all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.